When we were going through the trench series last year, I said that if the trench theory holds true, and I expect that it will, then there's an inevitable outworking of that which would then lie in front of us in the years ahead. There's this path that we're all going to have to walk, or endure, you could say, actually, because very few of us actually want to go down this path. But our culture seems set on pursuing this globalist, left-wing, soft virtues at all costs ideology, and it will do so until the folly of that becomes clear and it reaches breaking point and it all collapses and falls apart. It's as T.S. Eliot said. He said, "The world is currently trying the experiment of attempting to form a civilized but non-Christian mentality. The experiment will fail, but we must be very patient in awaiting its collapse, meanwhile redeeming the time so that the faith may be preserved alive through the dark ages before us, to renew and rebuild civilization and save the world from suicide." So this experiment is currently being tried by globalist, far-left ideologues. They think it's going to create utopia, but it will fail. But these ideologues currently have control. They've got control of all our institutions and apparatus of state, so they're able to drag us in this direction against most of our will. And there are behind them even spiritual forces who are exerting control, and they're able to pull the world in this direction that, again, the majority of us don't want. I've been coming across a lot of videos recently where predominantly non-Christians actually are beginning to voice this feeling of inevitability, this feeling of powerlessness, that nothing we say or do or vote for seems to be making a difference to our direction of travel. Whatever happens, we just keep heading in this direction. So I'll just get into this and hopefully it'll make sense. I'm going to pull from lots of different sources. I'll collate them all together and try and create a narrative that presents an overview of what seems to be happening. I hope you find this interesting and informative. In 2010, the United Kingdom elected what they thought was a Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron. If you're not familiar with British politics, there are two main parties. They are Labour, who are on the left, and the Conservatives, who are on the right. They're also sometimes called the Tories. We do have others who take up a smaller share of the vote. It's a multi-party system, but those are the two main ones. So if you want a left-wing government, you would tend to vote Labour, and if you want a right-wing government, you would tend to vote Conservative. Now, at the time of making this video, it's been 13 years of straight Conservative governance. They've dominated at the ballot box. They won 4 elections in a row. The last one they won by a landslide, which suggests that the people of this country have been asking for conservative policies during that time. Now, what are some conservative policies? Well, it's low government interference, small state, it's low taxation, freedom of speech, traditional family values, emphasis on law and order, encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging the individual to get ahead and do well for himself, and so forth. And yet the legacy of the past 13 years of so-called conservative rule has been nothing of the sort. They've opposed traditional family values by legalizing gay marriage. In 2014, that happened on conservative rule. They don't enforce law and order. They're allowing illegal immigration to soar. They've apparently given up on investigating real crimes like thefts and burglaries. If you get burgled, then don't bother calling the police because they're not coming. Instead, they're spending more time virtue signaling at gay pride events and dancing and painting their cars in rainbow colors and arresting people for freedom of speech because their words hurt the feelings of the LGBTQ plus whatever community. And they're arresting people for quoting the Bible in public, and they're arresting people for praying silently in public. The Conservative Party are further aiming to crack down on freedom of speech with their online harms bill, which would require social media companies to remove anything that could be considered hate speech, which again could simply mean Christians quoting the Bible, and they would get a criminal record thereafter. They're planning to criminalize helping gay and trans people to heal from their trauma and their gender dysphoria. In 2020, they copied communist China by imposing lockdowns on the entire population for COVID, literally locking innocent citizens inside their homes for 23 hours a day. They suspended democracy for 2 years and oversaw an unprecedented period of state control and authoritarian tyranny in this country. They deliberately lied and tried to fearmonger the British people regarding masks and vaccines, and this has now been proven beyond all doubt with the release of Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages, what's become known as the lockdown files. They've also imposed the highest tax burden on the British people since World War II. They've also signed up to climate alarmism, meaning they're banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030, which is obviously going to impact people's freedom of movement. And they're also banning the fitting of gas boilers in new homes from 2025 as well. I could go on and on and on, but what has happened, as you can see, is that although the people have repeatedly voted for conservative governance and conservative policies, in practice what's happened, the reality is that the policies have been pushing the country further and further towards the left. Increased state meddling, higher taxes, all left-wing policies. The Conservative Party has been neither economically conservative or socially conservative. What's really happened in Britain is this: we don't have a right and left-wing option anymore. We've got a left-wing option, which is the Conservatives, or we've got a far-left option, which is Labour. But whichever we vote for, it doesn't matter, we still keep going left. Which brings me to this first clip. This is George Galloway. He's an ex-member of Parliament, but it should be noted that he's a staunch socialist. His original roots are actually in the Labour Party, but even he says this.
They are liberals, and liberalism is what has put us in the mess we're in. Of that I'm absolutely certain. It deprived Britain of an actual Labour Party and Labour opposition. It infused the so-called Conservative Party. In fact, I'll say to you, Neil, that the Liberals have ruled in perpetuity in this country for the last 30 years or more, whether wearing Conservative hats or Labour hats. The Blairites, the Blairite Liberals, have been in charge in the Conservative Party until now, and in the Labour Party. And so we have a unipolar polity. We have a one-party state.
So whatever party we vote for, it doesn't really matter because we just keep on heading in the same direction. Now let's just park that idea there for a moment and let's move on to Brexit now. In 2016, Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron, who was a believer in the European Union, took a big risk by allowing the British people a referendum on whether we wanted to stay in that union. You see, Britain had been part of the European project since 1973. The European project is a cornerstone of globalism. But the people didn't vote to go into Europe, and what became clear was that over the years the British people were increasingly uncomfortable about what they'd actually been signed up to here. As a fiercely independent nation who has a long history of unbroken freedom and democracy, it was troubling when we began to realise what the ultimate aim of the EU was. It was to gradually absorb us into this EU superstate where we would ultimately be ruled from Brussels rather than from London. The individual nations of Europe would gradually lose their independence and individual sovereignty and become a mere subsidiary, a mere state of the EU. And with every passing year, new laws were being written and enacted that were transferring power from the capitals of Europe, whether it be London, Paris, Madrid, or Rome, to the centralized location at the headquarters of the EU in Brussels. And again, this sense of powerlessness then began to grow because it seemed that whatever we voted for at the British level didn't actually matter anymore, because ultimately the EU was over and above our elected officials and courts and democratic systems. Ultimately, the European Parliament was now dictating to us. For example, the British people made it clear that we didn't want unfettered illegal immigration, but whenever someone at the British level tried to do something about that, the EU would just intervene and tell them that we had to have open borders. And that was a stipulation of being in the EU. There are also many examples of British judges, even at the High Court level, the highest court in the land, making decisions that were later overturned by the European courts. So the EU was dictating to us even the laws of our land, and we had no option but to comply because we'd signed up to this thing. That's why we voted for Brexit. We wanted our national sovereignty back, our democracy, our freedom. We wanted our voice back. Now, when we voted to leave the EU, however, it was clear that the globalists within the British establishment were panicked by this. They were horrified. They didn't think that we would actually do it. David Cameron had to resign over this issue. So there were years of people trying to thwart Brexit, trying to water it down, trying to rerun the vote to get a different result, just to make sure that this thing did not happen. There was a fifth column within the UK establishment working against the democratically expressed will of the British people. However, after they conceded that they couldn't stop it and it was going to happen, they then changed tack. And their mission now is to make sure that Brexit cannot be a success. If Britain is successful as an independent nation again, other countries might follow suit and then globalism starts to unravel and be reversed. So we find our government today strangely refusing to pursue the potential advantages of independence. We're now free. We're not chained to the EU's endless red tape and bureaucracy, which was holding us back. It was making us sluggish. But the government is not pursuing the advantages. Now that leads us to this next clip. This is Ian Duncan Smith. He was the leader of the Conservative Party from 2001 to 2003, and he notes that this Conservative government seems to be holding the UK back. It's not cutting the red tape and the bureaucracy. It's not cutting taxes. It's still this high meddling, big state, left wing kind of government. It's not pursuing the advantages that Brexit could afford us. Here's that clip.
Tax take on the UK economy is at the highest rate it's been in pretty much my, well, not my whole life, but my adult lifetime, pretty much. And the problem right now is that getting economies like the UK out of this seemingly spiral cycle of higher taxes, higher interference, higher meddling by government is becoming really difficult to see the way out of this at this stage. You know, we did it under Thatcher. We got going. The British economy grew. It was entrepreneurism raged. Right now, we are in general danger of stifling that. The UK economy, they're not alone in this, by the way. Most of the European economies in much a similar position, and possibly America will be too. Means we're going to bounce around, and that's when we're going to get these crises in banking, etc., because the economies themselves aren't dynamic in the sense that they are. Now, we have an opportunity to make ours more dynamic, to boldly take these areas of regulation post-Brexit, where we cut the regulations, change the...
But we seem to be going in the opposite direction.
Now, what's interesting is that last year the Conservatives briefly flirted with the idea of actually being conservative, at least economically. They voted to make Liz Truss the leader of their party and therefore the Prime Minister of the nation. And she came to the forefront primarily on the promise that she was going to take advantage of Brexit. She was going to reduce taxes, reduce red tape, deregulate, get the economy moving again.
The political debate has been dominated by the argument about how we distribute a limited economic pie. Instead, we need to grow the pie so that everyone gets a bigger slice. That is why I'm determined to take a new approach and break us out of this high-tax, low-growth cycle. I will not allow the anti-growth coalition to hold us back. It's always more taxes, more regulation, and more meddling. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
Now, I'm not an apologist for Liz Truss. I don't think that she was strategic or subtle enough to defeat the fifth column within the establishment. But when she came to power, to her credit, she tried to implement all of these plans for low tax and deregulation. But what happened was the global financiers of the world instantly stepped in to make sure that it could not happen. They gave the UK a kicking, the pound plummeted, there was panic in the markets. Liz Truss then tried to appease everyone by firing her chancellor, and instead she appointed a globalist, Jeremy Hunt, an anti-Brexit campaigner, someone who would not deviate from the globalist plan, high meddling, high taxes, big state. And this led to Nigel Farage, the architect of Brexit, to call it a globalist coup.
This is a coup, isn't it, Nigel?
Oh, absolutely. It's a globalist coup. Jeremy Hunt is now the president of the United Kingdom. Truss is irrelevant. Whether she stays or goes tomorrow is completely irrelevant. Hunt has been chosen. And I'd love to know who spoke to Liz Truss and told her that Hunt had to have this top job, whether it was the IMF, the White House, the German Chancellor, all of them. It's perfectly clear they're all delighted that he's there. They planned this to be the first of many. This is a globalist coup. It is a Remainer coup. The Conservative Party is now showing its true colours.
Now, in the end, Liz Truss herself had to resign as well. She lasted for just 49 days in office. It was a big embarrassment for the United Kingdom. And as Paul Embry said, this whole Liz Truss debacle has just confirmed that financial markets cannot be challenged. That's become embedded in our politics. So effectively, the governments of the world are under the control of global financiers. The financiers make sure that governments do their bidding. If the government does something the global financiers don't like, and which isn't according to their agenda, they pull levers, they take you down, they seal your fate, they make sure that your government cannot function, it cannot exist any longer. Now that Liz Truss is out of office, but having been in power just long enough to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, she recently made quite an interesting speech where she talked about this globalist agenda.
Let's be clear. The free world is in danger. We're living in very turbulent economic times, right through from the shock of the financial crisis through to the COVID crisis that we're still recovering from. We have less of the world's population living under democracy than we did 30 years ago. Meanwhile, we have authoritarian regimes that are building up their armaments as well as they're building up their arguments. And they're not just trying to convince their own populations. They're also trying to win over global opinion. And they're trying to create a new global world order.
So there's a globalist plan to create a more authoritarian and less democratic New World Order. And the idea that there are globalist agents embedded within Western democracies isn't a new idea. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum openly boasted a long time ago that their organization has, in his words, managed to penetrate the governments of the world.
Actually, this notion to integrate young leaders is part of the World Economic Forum since many years. And I have to say, when I mention now names like Mrs. Merkel, even Vladimir Putin and so on, they all have been young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. But what we are very proud of now is the young generation, like Prime Minister Trudeau, President of Argentina and so on, is that we penetrate the cabinets. So yesterday I was at a reception for Prime Minister Trudeau, and I know that half of this cabinet, or even more half of this cabinet, are actually young global leaders of the World Economic Forum.
And that's true in Argentina too. Wow. Yeah. Sorry. That's true in Argentina as well.
It's true in Argentina, and it's true in France now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm with the president, with a young global leader. In addition to the young global leaders, we have now the global shapers in 450 cities around the world. I just wonder, is there any...
Just quickly, it was also interesting to read Suella Braverman recently, the current Home Secretary, the next in a long line of incumbents who have been tasked with trying to stop illegal immigration. She's openly voiced her frustration that there is an activist blob of left-wing lawyers, civil servants and the Labour Party who are embedded within the system, thwarting the UK government from doing its job in stopping the stream of illegal boats. So again, the message just keeps coming through that no matter what you want, say, do or vote for, it's not going to change anything. The left has control of the institutions and they will have their way. So then finally, I get to this clip where Russell Brand uses a very valuable illustration around all of this. He says it's almost like there's an algorithm at work in the world, which is pulling us in this direction and we just can't seem to stop it.
I've heard a few things about systems that help me to understand why such a thing might be possible. I heard one time that the CIA, no one person knows what's going on. Like, it's so diffuse. There are so many operations, so many things running concurrently that there isn't a person like the head of the CIA that you can go to and say, well, what's going on? Like, it's too diffuse. I also heard a person, like Yanis Varoufakis, he was like one of the leaders of Syriza when after 2008, Greece had some wacky like moment where they elected an extremist party, left-wing extremist party actually, that considered extreme, that said we're not paying back all of that banking debt. We're not going to pay it back. And the people, of course, of Greece voted for him. And then the EU called in that government once they won the election and said, you are paying back that money. You can't make that decision. You don't have that authority. And this guy Yanis Varoufakis, who's like a left-wing politician, said that he realised that the person at the EU that he was talking to didn't have any power. They only have the power that role affords them. The system is essentially functioning on its own. There is no individual that can go, oh yeah, all right, then don't pay back the money. There is no person that can tell you exactly what the CIA is doing. So it's like a sort of a set of coordinates which behind it has an energy that's pushing towards a particular agenda, the kind of ones that all of us can identify, financial agenda, dominion, those kind of identifiable agenda. But the system is self-sustaining, self-maintaining. The system excludes the possibility for disruption. It's almost like it already functions how an algorithm would function. It doesn't afford radicalism. It doesn't afford the intervention of democracy. When people's will is expressed, the will is delegitimized. When there is a sort of a popular uprising, then the uprising itself is discredited. 20, 30 years ago, it would have been the left in Latin America, Central America, like the deposing and destabilizing nations there. Now it's like even domestically, like figures like from the presumed right, like Trump, are discredited. So like, and again, like I've got, just to clarify, of course, it's not someone that I would ally myself with enormously. But what I'm saying is that the system has clearly become more allied with a particular aspect of the establishment. Let's call it the liberal establishment, although it feels to me that it can function perfectly well regardless of which political party parties.
Yeah,
and
I think it's interchangeable.
There's something in this algorithm idea. I think that's a really good analogy. That's how it feels as well to me sometimes. On social media, you think that it's a level playing field, and you would like to believe that it's a level playing field and everyone has the same chance to be seen and heard. But then you discover there's this opaque and mysterious force behind it all called the algorithm that nobody really understands, but it's manipulating the whole platform to push it in a certain direction. It's shutting down these voices, it's amplifying these voices. So the outcome's actually being engineered and determined by the coders of that algorithm. And then what seems to happen is that the algorithm itself seems to become self-sustaining. It takes on a life of its own, almost to the extent that even the engineers are not fully understanding of why the algorithm is doing what it's doing. They just know that it's been coded to point in a certain direction. And it feels like the whole world has become a bit like that. We all like to feel that we're contributing in a functioning democracy and our voice matters and our vote matters, but then there's this undeniable feeling of this nebulous force behind the whole thing that makes sure that no matter what we say, do, or vote for, there's only ever going to be one outcome. Vote for this party or vote for that party, it doesn't matter, we're still going to go left. Vote for Brexit or don't vote for Brexit, that doesn't change the outcome either. We're still going to get globalism. Change your prime minister or president, that doesn't matter. Try and reform your institutions, that won't change a thing. This nebulous force just makes sure that we keep on track towards that one destination. And I think it's also true that the whole thing seems to be self-perpetuating. Do you remember when I did Know Your Enemy, I talked about the Prince of Tyre and the King of Tyre, that whole principle. The Prince of Tyre is the human being, but then behind it, there's the King of Tyre, which is the spiritual force. And the princes come and go, but the king always remains. So I think it's missing the point when people get bogged down on personalities like Klaus Schwab or Bill Gates or Anthony Fauci. I think it's very instructive and useful to see what they're up to and see what they're doing. But actually, this is so much bigger than any of them. It goes so much deeper than any one person, and we always have to keep our mind on that truth. These people will come and go, they'll pass across the stage, they'll have their day in the limelight, and then they'll exit the stage. But this whole thing is going to keep moving on. The Bible says, "For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places." I think this is an element of this whole thing that only Christians will really understand. But it is something that we have to keep at the forefront of our minds. This is a spiritual battle. Now, this is a very long video and I've already spoken for far too long, so I'm going to try and wrap this up. I don't even really have a conclusion here. I guess my next line of thought is, what happens when everyone begins to feel this or realize this? What happens when people begin to feel disenfranchised and disempowered and feel like their future is not actually in their hands and their vote is not making a difference, but actually they're being dictated to by unelected globalists and a self-sustaining algorithmic machine? Is there an historical precedent for this, which might give us insight into where this goes next? I don't know, I've spoken too long. I just wanted to tell you about this thing because this is what's been on my mind of late, and I just thought I'd share this and basically see what you think.